After studying this module, you would be able to learn about the key concepts of the cognitive behavioral paradigm, understand the counseling process of the cognitive behavioral approach, examine the counseling techniques and procedures involved, and evaluate the limitations and criticisms of cognitive behavioral counseling. Cognitive behavior therapy, or CBT, which combines principles associated with information processing and learning theories, is relatively a young and rapidly developing area of psychotherapy. This emphasis on cognitive processes represents a shift from stimulus response and drive models to the dynamics of systems and subsystems of thought. Though cognitive behavioral interventions for individual problem differs in their form and application, all of them apply the same underlying principle. CBT may accurately be curative, that is, there is evidence that CBT can reduce risks so that clients need not to stay in treatment forever, or that problem can actually be prevented. The counselor does not force ideas upon the clients, but rather attempts to provide him or her with graded tasks or homework assignments in order to instill new ways of thinking, and thereby through instructions and modeling attempts to alter negative thought patterns with more adaptive ones.
A core assumption of cognitive behavioral approaches is that people actively process information. Aaron Beck introduced three important concepts in his original cognitive model of depression to explain the psychological characteristics of this disorder, which in turn have provided a large amount of information about other disorders as well. First, Beck introduced the concept of cognitive triad. The second core component is the schema. Once activated, schemas can have effects reaching far beyond the immediate situation. Finally, he introduced the concept of faulty information processing. The main goal of cognitive behavior counseling is to address these errors and help client overcome them. Thoughts can often be changed directly, in which case clients are instructed to be attentive to subsequent changes in their mood, physiology, and behavior. Important targets of CBT includes beliefs and expectancies about oneself and one's future, about others and about the world. As the client becomes aware of these underlying processes, it becomes easier to help them to evaluate their own negative automatic thoughts and to restructure them to more rational and adaptive ones. At the same time, being cognizant of how changing thinking patterns can influence feelings as well as patterns of behavior. Ingram, Kendall, and Shen presented following core characteristics of the approach which distinguished it from other approaches. First, while other mechanisms might be operating, cognitive mechanisms form the basis of conceptualization of the onset and course of a problem. They are considered to be an important causal and maintaining mechanism. Second, as these cognitive variables can be causal and maintaining agents, therefore, majorly intervention strategies focus upon cognitive targets. Third, a functional analysis comprising of cognitive, behavioral, and affective factors of the maintaining variables is undertaken. Fourth, both the techniques are used interchangeably, that is, behavioral strategies are used to target cognitive objectives and cognitive strategies are used to produce a positive behavior change. Fifth, empirical verification is emphasized in three different ways. First, on the basis of empirical research, the validity of therapeutic procedures are verified. Causal factors for change are observed. Second, objective assessment provides another way to assess therapeutic procedures. And finally, client himself or herself is taught to gather data to test their own assumptions and beliefs. Sixth, as interventions are time limited, booster or maintenance sessions may be applied as required. Seventh, the client and his or her counselor hold a collaborative relationship with one another, which facilitates rapid and smooth attainment of predetermined goals. Eighth, cognitive behaviorally oriented counselors are active rather than being passive or non-directive. Ninth, the understanding of the cognitive behavioral model of dysfunction is deemed important, whereby the client is educated about how their thoughts maintain a dysfunction and why this modification of dysfunctional cognition is deemed important for adaptive behavior. Tenth, they serve as coping model wherein they provide demonstrations in role plays of ways to manage dysfunction and different situations. Cognitions are the central components of cognitive behavior counseling, around which all its principles, techniques, and processes revolve. Therefore, a discussion about its detailed features becomes important. Ingram and Kendall highlighted following four important features of cognition. First, cognitive structures. They are the mental templates which are developed by accumulation of past experiences and functions to guide, influence, and filter the understanding of our future experiences. Cognitive content. Cognitive content are the ongoing thoughts, self-talk, or the information stored from past memories. Cognitive structures serve to trigger these automatic cognitive contents by channelizing the structuring of information processing. Cognitive processes. Cognitive process refers to the procedure by which the entire cognitive system operates. For example, the ways in which we perceive a situation, recall content from our past similar experiences, and combine the information to interpret the present situation. Search and storage mechanisms, inferential and retrieval processes are examples of cognitive process. Cognitive products. Cognitive products are the end products of the interplay between above mentioned mechanisms. They are the thoughts and individual experiences as a result of the interaction between content, process, and structure, and can be illustrated by causal attributions. A problem may develop due to disturbance or imbalance in any of the above mentioned processes, and hence in-depth consideration of each of these processes is very important to gain understanding of the underlying problem, and thereby development of an accurate management plan. Else, a failure in counseling may set in. For example, a young adult who has a schema for threat, cognitive structure, about danger, evaluative and physical, would have automatic thoughts, internal questions, and internal self-talk, cognitive content, that would be inconsistent with the schema. Worry. The final cognitive product this individual will have will be determined by his cognitive structure, content, and process, and therefore, as a result of which he or she might pay selective attention to negative cues from the environment and exhibit cognitive dysfunctions. Consequently, he or she will anticipate danger in events and have demanding expectations about future. These cognitive dysfunctions can be subdivided under the following two heads. First, cognitive deficiencies. Absence of thinking where it would be beneficial, or, for example, when somebody tends to act before thinking. Individuals with this type of cognitive processing usually fail to engage in the forethought and planning. As a result, they might end up exhibiting a behavior which might be inappropriate to the context of situation, as not well thought of. Cognitive distortions. Conversely, people who have distorted cognitions are not deficient in information processing but are carrying it out in a dysfunctional or crooked manner. Hence, the process and the logic applied to that thought is dysfunctional, giving birth to future maladaptive behavior patterns. Cognitive behavior counseling aims to elicit, evaluate, and modify negative automatic thoughts, cognitive distortions, and maladaptive schemata using a range of cognitive, emotive, and behavioral techniques mentioned as follows. First, inculcating skills to recognize, evaluate, and change relevant cognitive processes in order to minimize distress experienced by the individual. Second, to help client understand the themes in maladaptive cognition in order to modify sets of attitudes and beliefs that are the basis of the client's susceptibility. The approach to a problem involves the following steps. First, eliciting automatic thoughts. Second, testing their accuracy and viability. Third, developing realistic alternatives. Fourth, identification of maladaptive schematas. And fifth, challenging maladaptive schematas. Cognitive phenomena that determine a pathology can be categorized under three broad headings. First, automatic thoughts. Second, schemata. And third, cognitive distortions. Automatic thoughts are the surface level of cognition that often maintain abnormal mood states and are transitory verbal and pictorial experience. They are called automatic in nature as they emerge spontaneously and are often difficult to resist. Despite being ubiquitous in nature, many people are still unaware of them and need to develop skills to identify them accurately. Only then it is meaningful to progress with counseling. Cognitive distortions refers to misinterpretation of reality that reinforces negative conclusions. Some types of cognitive distortions can be described as follows. First, overgeneralization, where a single event is interpreted as an example to a wide range of situations. Second, dichotomous thinking, in which only one extreme viewpoints are considered. Third, selective abstractions, attending to a only biased negative aspect of the situation. Fourth, personalizing, assuming oneself to be the cause of any problem experienced by self or others. Fifth, catastrophizing, giving greater weight to the worst possible outcome, however unlikely, or experiencing a situation as unbearable or impossible when it is just uncomfortable. And finally, minimization, emphasizing negative and downplaying positive comments. Schemata, information about oneself and one's environment is perceived, stored, and recalled through schemata. Psychopathological states result from schemata that facilitate interpretation of situations in terms of threat to self, such as loss, failure, rejection, and danger. CBT has clearly defined roles for both the counselor and the client, who are equally active in the counseling process. The counselor assumes the role of an educator as he teaches his or her client different cognitive models to understand the reasons and maintaining factors of clients' specific problems. He also teaches various cognitive and behavioral techniques designed to help in alleviating their problems. The client is considered to be the best judge about his or her personal experience. Both of them work together to achieve enlisted goals. The ultimate goal is to help client think about himself or herself and his or her situations, as this will be the deciding factor whereby a counselor would evaluate how well the client has been able to understand the processes underlying counseling and effectively is able to generalize them to other situations outside the counseling session. Three traditions, experimental psychology, behavioral techniques, and psychodynamic approaches, have majorly influenced the development of cognitive behavior counseling. Cognitive behavioral theories resulted from a gradual evolution of reactions to the psychoanalytical theories that dominated psychology in 1960s. Psychoanalytic paradigm majorly emphasized upon the interplay between unconscious intrapsychic processes and early childhood experiences as responsible for development of a pathology. Owing to the underlying lengthy processes, subjectiveness and time involvement, and an ongoing controversy about its relative effectiveness, psychoanalytical constructs were never conducive to empirical investigation or validation. Hence, a growing dissatisfaction with these factors led to a rise in interventions based on behavioral theories. Behavioral theories in 1960s and early 1970s were based on the principles of learning. Seminal work of the Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov on the principles of classical conditioning was one of the earliest influences on behavioral models. John Watson and his colleagues demonstrated that specific fears could be both conditioned and deconditioned in human beings via the principles of classical conditioning. Using these findings, Joseph Volpe developed an intervention strategy for human anxiety referred to as somatic desensitization, wherein deep muscular relaxation is paired with the images of an anxiety-provoking situations. B.F. Skinner explored another learning principle called operant conditioning. Theories based on operant conditioning rest on the notion that many behaviors are performed spontaneously and are controlled primarily by their consequences. Thus, the removal of a reinforcing consequence should decrease the frequency of an unwanted behavior, and conversely, applying a reinforcing consequence should increase the frequency of a desired behavior. Behavioral techniques were compatible with experimental methodologies, was time efficient, and here yielded success in reducing anxiety and overcoming maladaptive avoidance behaviors. Albert Ellis has been credited for his pioneering work in formulating the first coherent system of cognitive behavioral counseling called rational emotive behavioral counseling. It involves direct cognitive debate, logical persuasion, and behavioral homework assignments to challenge irrational beliefs and negative thinking. One of the highly influential figures in the history of cognitive therapy was Aaron Beck. He placed a great deal of emphasis on the cognitive aspects of psychopathology, at the same time emphasizing upon the integration of established behavioral techniques as well. An integral part of CBT, besides understanding the cognition, is to conduct an accurate, valid, and reliable assessment of the client in the view of his or her presenting problems. Cognitive behavior assessment has two important foci. Assessment procedures are considered to be the hypothesis testing endeavors, in which the counselor formulates certain hypotheses about the client and his or her behavior in the given set of situations, tests them, and thereby either accept or reject them. Acceptance and rejection of such hypotheses provides important information which helps the counselor to devise an effective management plan. Hypotheses formulated usually centers around the current behavior, thought pattern, his or her affective, social, and environmental conditions, etc., which are expected to be precipitating or maintaining the current situation. Cognitive behavioral assessment does not focus attention upon uncovering underlying personality characteristics or traits that are assumed to be causal factors in current distress, unlike other traditional assessment methods. Also, cognitive behavioral assessment strives to take sampling as opposed to a symbolic approach to choosing and interpreting the results of testing as opposed to more traditional assessment procedures, which view the testing results as an indirect manifestation of underlying personality traits which are thought to be causing the problem. Assessment procedures are considered as a means for evaluating effectiveness of a specific intervention procedure. They provide us with an opportunity to conduct pre and post-intervention assessment, which help us determine the progress the client has made over the time duration in which counseling was given to him or her, and thereby ascertaining its effectiveness. Modes of assessment: behavioral interview, self-monitoring, self-report, questionnaires, rating scales, etc., information from other people, interview with important individuals, observation of important individuals, direct observation, role play, behavioral experiments, physiological measures. Cognitive behavior therapists Counselor usually gathers assessment data from multiple modalities in order to secure high reliability and validity standards of the collected information. Typically, paper-pencil questionnaires, structured interviews, and behavioral observation form the cornerstones of cognitive behavioral assessment, as no single approach will be sensitive enough to capture the complexities of human behavior in its concrete form. Also, equally important to the method of data collection is the source from which the data is generated. Ideally, it is recommended that information should be gathered from multiple sources so as to eliminate the perceptual bias, for example, gathering information from client family members, peer group, relatives, colleagues, etc.
Now let us summarize this module. CBT is relatively a brief, active directive and empirically based form of psychotherapy which emphasizes collaborative problem solving by focusing its attention on how a cognitive phenomenon maintains emotional distress and self-defeating behaviors. It entails clear technical guidelines and has arguably been evaluated in a greater number of methodologically sound studies than any other form of psychotherapy and counseling.